Hello and welcome to your earthquake case study comparison video. In this you are going to gain the knowledge to be able to compare your MEDC and LEDC earthquake. There are 4 questions on this page which you will need to be able to use this knowledge for, and they centre around knowing the causes, the primary and secondary impacts of the earthquake, and also the responses, preparation, prediction and protection. Okay, so have a good look at the question, the command words, and the knowledge that you're going to note down and learn would then need to be used to answer these. First of all, we're going to go through the geographical background to the earthquake case studies. So our MEDC example, so our rich part of the world, is the city of Kobe in Japan, whereas our LEDC example, or poorer part of the world, is Sichuan, which is a region in China. The MEDC example occurred on the 17th of January 1995, whereas the Sichuan example was the 12th of May 2008. Okay, so the Chinese example is more recent. Time of day for Japan's earthquake was 5:46 a.m, so bright and early in the morning, whereas for China, its earthquake was at 2:28 p.m. in the afternoon. The Richter scale is quite similar between them, 7.2 compared to 7.9. So if everything was the same in both countries, then the level of damage should be similar. However, there are other underlying factors which means that this is not the case. The duration of the earthquake in Japan was 20 seconds on solid rock, but on the reclaimed land in the harbour, so soft unconsolidated rock, the shaking continued for 2 to 3 minutes. In the Sichuan earthquake, it was 120 seconds or 2 minutes that the earthquake lasted for. The depth of focus in Japan's earthquake was 16 kilometres. It's a shallow focus earthquake, quite near the surface, hence quite a lot of damage. And the LEDC example of Sichuan was 19 kilometres below the surface. The epicentre, the place where the effects of the earthquake are felt, was the Awaji Island in Osaka Bay for the Kobe 1995 earthquake, whereas in the Sichuan earthquake it was 80 kilometres northwest of the Sichuan region capital city of Chengdu. Okay, so that's your geographical background. Remember, you use this knowledge for your introduction to your 8-mark question. Moving onwards to the causes of the earthquake. The Kobe earthquake was formed due to action at a destructive plate margin. This is where the Philippines plate, oceanic crust, subducted beneath the Eurasian plate, continental crust, and the pressure is released along a fault line called the Najima fault line. In the Sichuan earthquake, it was a totally different plate margin. Instead of a destructed, it was a collision margin, and this is where 2 continental plates, the Indian plate and the Eurasian plate, collided and buckled upwards, and the pressure was released along a fault line called the long-mentioned fault line. One of the possible exam questions you could get could be, describe and explain the causes of an earthquake you have studied. On this slide here, you'll see that you've got 2 model examples of how to describe the Kobe earthquake and how to describe the Sichuan earthquake. Have a look at the key terms that have been used, the sequence that has been put together, and the explanation of how the pressure was released. Make sure that you can produce a similar answer independently without having to refer to your notes. Take time now to stop this video and read this through. Another key area that you could be examined on is the effects of an earthquake. So we can categorize the effects of an earthquake into primary and secondary effects. Primary effects being those that happen immediately, so straight away, hours, maybe weeks after the event. And secondary effects is months and years after the event. So with the Kobe 1995 earthquake, 6,434 people died, whereas in the Sichuan earthquake, 69,000 people died, so significantly higher number. And lots of the deaths in China were actually children because the schools collapsed. 40,000 people were injured in the Kobe earthquake, whereas 374,000 people were injured in the Sichuan earthquake. 300,000 people were made homeless in Japan, whereas in China, 5 million people were made homeless. So as we can see, the primary effects of the earthquakes were much worse for the Chinese earthquake, which is to be expected as it is an LADC country, whereas Kobe is our MEDC example. The secondary effects also differed. In Japan, $220 billion worth of damage was done, whereas in China it was $75 million worth of damage. Fires raged all over the city in Japan, whereas roads were blocked by landslides in China. In Japan, the economy suffered. Panasonic had to temporarily close, which had a knock-on effect on people's jobs and livelihoods. Having just discussed with you the different primary and secondary effects of the earthquake, I did mention the fact that they're both different levels of development, so an LEDC and MEDC. That's one factor that would influence the level of damage caused, but there are also others that relate to each individual place. So, for example, in the Kobe earthquake, the epicenter was close to a heavily populated area, a city. As a result, there was more people around that could have been affected. There were over 1,300 aftershocks after the initial earthquake. These are small tremors that can weaken the already weakened buildings and cause further damage. Thirdly, most deaths happened in the old residential areas where the buildings were wooden and not been earthquake-proofed. This is where most of the old people lived, and the houses were so close together that when they caught fire, they kind of knocked into each other like the domino effect. In the Sichuan earthquake, lots of the school buildings collapsed as they had been built from cheap building materials and they did not withstand the earthquakes, hence the reason why so many children were killed in this earthquake event. Also, the time of day that the earthquake occurred in China was in the afternoon. This is when children were in school and they were inside the school buildings, hence when the buildings collapse, this is why the significant number of children were killed. Landslides blocked the roads, so it was hard for search and rescue teams to get to people quickly, and troops had to go on foot. As a result, there could have been more deaths because people weren't accessed, they weren't rescued soon enough, so they may have died under the rubble. You also need to be aware of the immediate and long-term responses to the earthquakes and to be able to say how they're similar and different between Kobe and Sichuan. So the immediate responses are hours, kind of days, weeks. And in Kobe, the emergency services searched for survivors and satellites were used to locate survivors in the rubble. Whereas in Sichuan, they sent in 50,000 army troops who weren't very specialists in the search and rescue aspect, but obviously bodies to go find people helped, and they went to go and help free the trapped survivors. But it took them 30 hours to get to the survivors, as the landslides that had happened meant that they couldn't access the areas by vehicles, they had to go on foot. In the Kobe earthquake and the Sichuan earthquake, helicopters were both used. In Kobe, there was more specialist rescue helicopters, and they immediately were able to locate survivors, whereas in the Sichuan earthquake, there were 20 helicopters used, but they weren't specialists and they weren't kind of fully prepared for the task ahead of them, and they only did this when it became difficult to access the areas due to landslides, so it wasn't an immediate reaction. Schools, town halls and open parks were turned into emergency centres in Japan, whereas survivors were operated on in hospital corridors or in the street in China. Major retailers such as the 7-Eleven provided essentials for survivors such as food, medicine, tents, clothing, whereas China was not able to provide its own residents with such essentials. And so instead, 2 days after the earthquake, China requested international help from Japan, Russia and South Korea and the Red Cross. The Red Cross went on to raise $100 million in just 2 weeks for them, in which the money was used to provide food, medicine, tents, blankets, and also fund doctors to come and help the survivors. Long-term responses. For Japan, millions of temporary homes were built for the survivors, whereas in Sichuan, 3.3 million tents were supplied to house any survivors. Earthquake survival kits were provided to each household in Japan, and they have installed more instruments to monitor earthquake movements. Whereas in Sichuan, any new designs for new buildings have to be earthquake proof, and then new different materials have to be used to prevent any future collapses of buildings. The last area of this case study covers the idea of prediction, protection, and preparation. You would have come across these before when we looked at volcanoes. There's some slight differences with earthquakes. So prediction is forecasting an event. Protection is where we construct buildings so that they're safe to live in and will not collapse. And then preparation is where we organise activities and drills so that people know what to do during an earthquake. So with regards to the Kobe 1995 earthquake, prediction, more instruments have since been installed to monitor earthquake movements. Protection, any new buildings have been built with concrete and reinforced steel. Buildings are to be built further apart to reduce the domino effect. And preparation, every 1st of September, is a public holiday in which the country practice earthquake drills to avoid any future losses. With regards to the Sichuan, China earthquake, since the earthquake, they have undertaken some aspects of protection, and new designs in different materials are being used to make future earthquake buildings earthquake-proof. That completes your case study video. So you should know detailed geographical background, you've got causes, you've got consequences, and you've got the responses. Okay, so you need to be able to compare and contrast these two case studies in any questions like those on the first slide of this video. Okay, good luck. Make sure that you have read through the information sheet that supports this. You've had a look at the video clips that have been provided on the VLE so that you've got a real good visual understanding of the damage and the cause and the responses to these events. Okay, thank you. Bye.